is share the outline for today's talk. Actually, before I put it up there, I'd like to begin the talk directly and just ask a few key questions. And of course, you don't need to reply, but I'd like to know, have you ever thought of these existential questions? Like, who am I? Or what is the purpose of life? What's the meaning of life? What should I do with my life? Or even, where did I come from? What was my life before this life? Was there anything? What was that? Or where am I going to go after I die? These are some common existential questions. Have you folks thought about these? I think it's safe to say most of us, if not everyone, has had this question or some of these questions in their minds. And are you curious what Buddhism has to say about it? And I guess you are because you're here. So with those questions in mind, I'd like to now share the outline in the chat. So it's a little messy because it can't be in outline form in the chat. But this brief outline will be what I plan to talk about today. So to address these existential questions, to look at how these questions are actually a representation of duality. And essentially, this kind of view, these questions are based on a confused view of reality, according to Buddhism. And I'll introduce the Buddha's middle way, which many people have heard of, the middle way, and a more superficial explanation, possibly. But I hope to talk about the middle way in depth as it is a not only a philosophy, but a practice to deconstruct our dualistic view. And then based on this middle way, I'd like to share what's Buddhism's view on human life, human death, and even the topic of rebirth, which is an interesting one. And then, of course, it will talk about transcending birth and death, which is sometimes described as escaping birth and death. I'll talk about this in terms of theory, in terms of Buddhist concept, and hopefully I'll have time to talk about the practice of the middle way, and in particular, the practice of a method of Chan Buddhism called Huatou. Huatou is a Chinese word. It can be roughly translated as critical phrase. So this is the plan for tonight. Can everyone see the outline in the chat? Yeah? Okay, great. So the three questions that I mentioned, who am I? Where do I come from? Where am I going to go after death? And then what's the meaning of life? The Buddha had found his own answers to these questions. And he didn't find them through just philosophy or just because he believed in something. He didn't invent anything, but he just had a direct realization or an insight into the nature of himself and his relationship with the world. What was his discovery? And I'll give the short answer first, because maybe some of you don't have time to hear the whole talk, or some folks just want to tune in for a bit. The short answer is really a simple one. Based on those three questions, the short answer is that it's not a question of being or not being, meaning we don't have to be concerned with a self coming from somewhere, even being here, or where that self will end up. Buddhism also says that there's really no birth and no death. And that may sound bizarre at first, but no birth and no death is the nature of things or the nature of reality. And what about meaning? Well, there's no fixed meaning. From the Buddhist perspective, there's no ultimate meaning or fixed meaning that everyone has to have or that everyone has to believe. So that's the short answer. It's one word, no, to the three questions. And it just means that there's ultimately no answer in words or theory that can really satisfy these questions. Because even if we knew all about Buddhism, even if we knew all the philosophies of the world, we knew all of the religious beliefs of the world, even if we had all of this knowledge, would it really save us from our confusion or our anxiety about life, about birth and death? For those of you who are already well versed in philosophy, you may realize that knowledge can't save you. Knowledge can't save us. Knowledge alone. So, Buddhism, especially at the outset, reminds us that all of the theory of Buddhism is not the ultimate truth and it can't save us. But Buddhism can help us find our own wisdom or help us find the answers for ourselves. So if we really want to be free from that confusion about birth and death, or even the confusion just about who we are, that takes not only some theory, some understanding, but it takes practice, which I'll talk about in the end. And the word for practice, according to the method of Huatou, is called, in Chinese, it's called 参禅, which literally means to investigate the mind or to investigate ourselves, an experiential investigation of the nature of our human experience. So the Buddhist path requires both theory, knowledge, and practice. And what's also interesting, although Buddhism doesn't say we should just believe this and you'll be saved, it also requires some faith because there's a lot that we haven't experienced yet. So in order to have confidence that any of this theory is remotely going to help us, there has to be a certain element of faith or belief in something we haven't yet experienced. So that's the short answer. For the long answer, I'd like to take time to talk about the traditional view or the theory of life and death as it's presented in different forms of Buddhist teaching. And what's universal about all traditions of Buddhism is that the main problem, the main reason why we are not able to really understand our human condition is because of confusion. Confusion being our mind is often very scattered and chaotic. There's lots of things that we're thinking about, worrying about, everything from, little problems of day-to-day life. Where did I put this? Where did I put that? to bigger problems of how can we pay the bills, or how can we manage our complicated relationships. There's so much that we have to worry about that these deeper questions about life are often just pushed to the background and we temporarily forget about them. And it's not that they're not important to us, but our mind is often chaotic, filled with lots of thinking and scattered thinking and emotional disturbance. So, in that kind of state of mind, it's really hard to have any clarity about ourselves or any deeper view of our human condition. So, that's often why we experience this anxiety. Because we all know that we're going to die someday, sooner or later. And many of us don't like to talk about it. It's even taboo to talk about it in certain cultures or certain families. I know of your experience, if maybe you started to think about your own mortality and plan for your funeral or to plan for your estate or belongings to be left to so and so, even bringing it up with the family member, they may be like, "Oh, why talk about this? Why talk about such a terrible thing? Let's just enjoy our party together. Or let's enjoy life." Um, Many people avoid the topic of death, but still there may be an anxiety, a deep anxiety there to avoid death, to try to forget about it, and just to try to enjoy life, enjoy the moment. So that anxiety or confusion in the back of our mind may be there for a long time. And for us to be willing to look deeper, for us to be able to investigate our experience more deeply, we need a calm mind. So I'd like to just take maybe half a minute or a minute to relax ourselves and calm our minds together. And how can we do that? Well, however you're sitting at home, you can check to see if you're sitting in a position that's comfortable and make sure that your back is upright, if it can be. Your clothing is loose, there's no pressure on your body. Take a moment to close your eyes and relax the muscles of your body. Take a deep breath and relax as you breathe out. There's no need to think about anything. The thoughts still come and go, and that's fine. Just let the thoughts come and let them go. Different feelings arise, and that's fine. Just let the feelings come and let the feelings go. There's no need to resist anything unpleasant. It just happens. We don't need to cling to the pleasant feelings because they go very quickly. They pass very quickly. Let's take a moment to sit and observe in silence, just experiencing sitting. Take another gentle, deep breath. Slowly move your body a bit. and then open your eyes. So, this investigation into ourselves, investigation into the nature of our human condition, birth, death, we need to do it with calmness. So, Buddhist practice, a big part of the meditation practice is calming the mind. When the mind is calm, then we can actually start to observe our experience more clearly. We can observe in the present moment the changing conditions of our body, of our feelings, of our thoughts, thinking, and all kinds of conscious activity. Buddhist practice is not just calming, but it's observing the nature of ourself in the present moment and how it changes and how it's affected by uh, these phenomena themselves as well as the environment. So Buddhist theory is not just based on thinking, that Buddha didn't come to conclusions through thinking. He observed, and what he observed, he shared in terms of a theory. And gradually, over the generations, this theory has become more systematized and organized. So, for today's talk, I'll be drawing from various sources, various discourses of the Buddha and discourses of other teachers to share about duality and to share about the middle way. But let's first talk about duality, the three questions that I brought up in the beginning. Who am I? Where did I come from? Where will I go? These questions are based on a duality. Duality meaning a sense of ourself being separate from everything else. Separate and also enduring in time, right? The question of where did I come from? Who am I now? Where will I go? This assumes that there's some part of us that's always the same, coming and going. Um, this is not only a deep belief in all of us, all human beings, all living beings. It's not just a belief, but it's a very deep sense or impression that there is something within us that's always the same. And we can reflect on this for a little bit. The idea or the word I that we're always using every day, I this, I that, I came from the store and now I'm here and afterwards I'm going to go do that. It's assuming that there's a part of us that's continuous and completely separate, coming and going. Um, in some spiritual traditions, that idea has been formulated into the idea of soul. Soul being this entity that before this life came from somewhere else, that's inside our body maybe or outside our body depending on the belief system, and that this soul will then transmigrate and go somewhere else at the end of this life. What does Buddhism say about that? Or what did the Buddha discover about this idea of self or belief in a permanent and separate self? The Buddha said it's the biggest problem that we have, and it's the source of all of our suffering and confusion. The attachment to ourself, to a soul, whatever we want to call it, is actually the source of all of our suffering. But why is that? Well, interestingly, if we believe that the self is somehow permanent, then we would want to hold on to things and believe that other things have permanence. If myself is permanent, then there's got to be something else permanent. And those other things permanent that are opposite to me, I want to keep the certain things that I like, and I want to get rid of the certain things that I don't like. And this is our whole life experience, right? From our own body, whether we like our own body or we don't like our body, or that we like a certain part of our body, we want a certain part to change, or the fact that our very own body is changing and aging and possibly getting sick as we speak, it creates so much fear and so much anxiety because we somehow believe that these things are permanent, or we want them to be more permanent. We know we're going to die, but at the same time, we don't want to. We know we're going to age, but at the same time, we use all kinds of products to try to preserve our body and prevent aging from happening, from wrinkles to what, all kinds of supplements, right? And I hope I remember his name. I think there's this retired businessman, or maybe he was in tech. This guy, Brian Johnson, is that his name? Was trying all these different techniques and using supplements to try to slow down his aging or even reverse the aging process. And it seems kind of cool, some of the results that he's getting. But, isn't it possible, or is it your own experience that we want things that are impermanent to be permanent and we try our best to maintain them? So our body is just one example. What about our relationships? When was the last time you thought about a person you love, and you just wished that they were the way they were before? And maybe you said to them, honey, what happened? You changed. Before you were so much, whatever, you're so much kinder or more patient. Now you're so impatient. What happened to you? Why did you change? The dynamic between people changes. But isn't it often the case that we would just wish it was the same? Um, we wish we felt the same way we did when we just fell in love. Couldn't it be always like that? And some couples may say, oh, yes, we feel the same way we do when we just got married. We're still madly in love. Um, I really wonder about that. Do they really feel that way? Is it the same as it was when they were first, when they fell in love? Or has it actually changed? Their emotions and feelings towards each other have changed as they've grown with each other, gotten to know each other. And even the things we possess in our life, the things that we really like, whether it's material things like our car, or we really like cars, maybe we like instruments, maybe we like this or that. But isn't it true that there's a lot of anxiety that comes from not wanting to lose those things, or not wanting those possessions to change or leave our hands to be possessed by somebody else? So at the base of all of this suffering is, as the Buddha uh, taught or had the insight, to self-attachment, the deep belief in the self as permanent, some part of us as permanent, as well as the objects in our world as permanent and potentially possessible, potentially able to be possessed by us. So we fear life and we crave life, we fear death. When a child is born, it's like a joyous thing, right? It's amazing. It's like, wow, another child is coming to the world. It's beautiful. And it is amazing, I think. And when death comes, we, feel so distraught and destroyed. I mean, isn't that universal? When there's a birth, it's so joyful. Well, if you planned, if you didn't plan the birth, maybe it's a big problem. But often birth is seen as something joyful, death is seen as something terrible. And we try to avoid death and loss of any kind at all costs. And we cherish birth, and we try to gain things and possess things at all costs. And this brings so much suffering. So that's where these questions come from. Where was I before I was born? What am I really now? And where will I go in the future? There was a student of the Buddha who eventually became a monk, as the story goes. And there's one discourse where this disciple asks the Buddha, he's like, and I'll read it here. He says, "Please teach me, world honored one," name for the Buddha. "I want to know, is the world eternal, or is it that it's annihilated? You know, meaning it eventually disappears. Does the universe have a limit or not? Is time infinite or finite?" In other uh, sources, he asks, "Is there a self or is there not a self? And if you can't answer me, I'm going to leave this community and find the answers somewhere else." And the Buddha replied, "When you became a monk, did I ever promise that I would answer these questions? Of course I didn't. I never promised that I would reply to these questions." So this person had a lot of existential questions. He just wanted answers. The Buddha just didn't answer. He later encouraged the person to practice and investigate for themselves. However, the Buddha over the years still presented many instructions or principles for how to practice, how to investigate ourselves. And we can describe it as the middle way of seeing reality, as opposed to the way of seeing reality dualistically based on the idea of a self, a permanent self, opposite to permanent objects in the world. So the middle way, in Chinese, it's called Zhong Dao. And the common explanation of the middle way, which many people hear, whether they're Buddhist or not, is we could describe it as um, a behavioral guideline, so that we want to avoid extremes of behavior, right? So when people say, "Oh, just, you could do whatever you want, just do it in moderation," right? Some people have the idea that the middle way just means moderation. Um, so if you really like chocolate cake, yeah, you can eat chocolate cake, but just eat it in moderation. Or if you like alcohol, you like to drink, you could drink, but just drink in moderation. And there's nothing wrong with that idea, because we know that drinking too much or eating too much of something causes harm to us. But the behavioral approach of the middle way is not just moderation of behavior, but it's avoiding an extreme of seeking pleasure or an aversion to the world, where someone may even seek pain, which sounds strange. But during the Buddhist time, there were some people who believed that um, freedom or true happiness can be found in sensual pleasure. So all the kind of pleasure that we can have through our bodily and even mental experience, seeing pretty things, smelling, tasting, all of that. Whatever is pleasant, they believed that that could lead to true happiness. It could be described as hedonism. The other extreme was that there were many ascetics, and there still are today, people who have an aversion to hedonism and even have an aversion to pleasure, or may even seek out painful experiences or put themselves through pain and torment for the sake of discipline, for the sake of training their mind in concentration and for training their will so that they can overcome craving to sensual pleasures with an iron will. And they can even endure the most pain with an iron will. That's a more of a behavioral and emotional standpoint of the middle way. It's to avoid those extremes. It's not moderation, it's just not seeking pain and not seeking pleasure as a means for happiness or freedom. But more important than this behavioral middle way is a cognitive stance or a view, a psychological view, or it's more accurate to say an experience of our condition, which avoids attaching to ideas of is or is not, being or non-being, which more concretely refers to not attaching to the view that I, as a permanent self, exist, nor thinking that at death, the self just disappears. There's nothing. Um, the middle way is not relying on or not attaching to this view of either permanence or annihilation. Either something exists, it exists for a short while, and then it disappears. So it's really a cognitive middle way. It's behavioral, emotional, and cognitive, avoiding extremes of behavior and even view of reality. So it's interesting that if we look at the core teachings of Buddhism, there's many different uh, levels of Buddhist theory and teaching, but we could boil it down to the core principles that makes Buddhism what it is. There are three. You may have heard the three Dharma seals, or the three characteristics of things, three characteristics of reality, which is impermanence, not self, and nirvana. Actually, all three of these are really negations of attachment to permanence, the negation of the view of self, and nirvana on a deeper level means actually uh, the extinction of all views, an experience of reality that goes beyond all views, even the ideas of impermanence and not self. So Buddhist theory is really at its core a negation of attachment to any kind of view. If we believe that I exist as a permanent self, the Buddha just said, there's no self. If we believe that something is permanent, the Buddha just said, there's really nothing that's permanent. And in the end, all of these views have to be wiped away in order to really experience reality as it is. So, I mean, isn't that interesting? The core of Buddhist theory is a guideline to help us let go of all theory, all views. But because of if that's all that was said about Buddhism, those three terms would definitely not be enough. You know, that would not be enough for us to have much direction on how to explore the nature of ourself. So that's why the Buddha went to great lengths um, to point out and negate dualism. Um, and part of the Buddhist tradition is to analyze the nature of reality and to show how the self is non-existent. So I'd like to go through this with everyone um, fairly briefly. The analytical approach to deconstructing the dualism of being and non-being. And I don't know if it's because I talk too slow, but it seems that time goes by very quickly. But briefly, to look at, again, being, if we have the view that I exist, even that there's a soul somehow within us, Buddhism says that actually that's not true. That's a false belief. Because if we look closely at this self that's a person, um, and we analyze our experience, we can see that this person is actually just made up of a constantly changing aggregate of experiences. And it's described as the human body, or the human body and mind, or this being is described as an aggregate of five things. Again, this is just a method of analysis, but it's quite interesting. So a human being is an aggregate of five things, or five aspects of experience. One is the body, physical form. And this aggregate also includes the physical world, so the environment, rocks, trees, cars, other people, birds, anything material is included under form. Second is feeling. Feeling refers to whenever we contact anything, we have a certain sensation that it's pleasant or unpleasant or neutral, maybe. We also have perceptions. So when we contact and feel things, we also have ideas about them. Like whenever we see something, we say, oh, look at that bird. Look at this car. Look at that other person. We're not just seeing and feeling, having a pleasant sight, experience of a pleasing sight, but our mind grasps onto what we see as an image, and we come up with names and concepts. That all falls under perception. And then we all have ideas and we think about things, and then we have motivation to do things. All of that is what's called mental formations, or sometimes translated as volitions. So it's our perceptions in motion. We act based on our perceptions. Oh, that's a nice car. I like that car because it has this and that, and it's an electric car, etc. All of our perceptions and our likes and dislikes, we then have volitions. And all of this experience transpires as part of our conscious experience. That's the fifth aggregate, consciousness, which includes seeing, hearing, feeling, tasting, touching, um, smelling. I didn't mention that, and thinking. All of these are just functions of being a conscious being. Consciousness in Buddhism is also developed later on, and it includes the ability to store and remember all of these experiences, as well as to store the tendencies of our behavior. Whatever we do, there's a tendency to do more of that. If we like something, there's a tendency to go after it. The Buddha found that among all of this all of these aspects of human experience, there's nothing that stays the same. The physical form, right? From when we were born to now, obviously changed, and is changing. Not to mention our feelings, which change even faster. We may feel great one minute, feel terrible the next minute. Perceptions, thinking, our consciousness, what we see from one moment to the next, it's all changing. So where can you find the self in any of these aspects? If all of them are changing moment to moment, where can the self be? We're always saying, I am doing this and I'm doing that. And where did I come from? Where am I going? It's existential questions. But if we look closely, where is the self? And can we show the self? If we say there's a soul, show us the soul. How can you see it? How can you know it? From the Buddhist perspective, the soul is actually imagination. It's just an idea, really. So through analysis, and this is not just through thinking analysis, but through experience and observation of our workings of body and mind, the self can't be found. It's just an aggregate of these changing conditions. And this is just a person, not to mention the environment, all the physical forms of the environment, all the other living beings of the environment. It's a constant exchange. When we behave in a way, it's an exchange. We're giving out our behavior to someone, affecting someone else. When they behave, their behavior affects us. So we're constantly molding each other, right? People who live together for a long enough time may start to realize that they act more like each other. And some people even say that the longer they have pets, they start to act like their pets. Maybe pets also act more human when they live with humans compared to dogs living by themselves in the wild. So this is a key teaching of Buddhism, that there's no self within the body and mind, or these different aspects of body and mind are not self, but they exist in a very dynamic and fluid way in relation to all other things. And the one principle that summarizes this reality is called conditioned arising. The Chinese is 缘起, conditioned arising as well as conditioned perishing. Things come together, things change due to different conditions, not just due to itself. Things come apart or disappear, so to speak, due to the separation of causes and conditions. Are you with me so far? So the Buddha, by saying there's no self within these aggregates, he's not somehow denying humanity, but he's pointing out that our human experience is a dynamic, integrated change. So if we look at birth, the phenomenon of birth, and I think this is fascinating. And this is incorporating some science because Buddhism didn't have our modern science at the time. But birth, what is birth? If we look at birth in the light of the middle way, if we look at birth as not a self coming from somewhere, but if we look at birth closely, isn't birth of a human being just a coming together of different conditions? Why does there need to be a self there? So we all know from high school biology when A man and a woman come together. They have intercourse. They have pregnancy. A baby or an embryo is created, right? That's a coming together of the sperm and the egg, as well as all the other biological processes that happen, which it's just so amazing how from these smaller, seemingly insignificant elements, if they come together in the right environment, the mother's womb, as well as if they have enough nutrition, and they have the right conditions, that the mother's healthy, that the mother's even, not anxious, she's emotionally stable, the mother has enough nutrition, the environment is stable, um, and the cells start to develop and the cells reproduce, and these two tiny elements grow into this complicated human being. That's so amazing. All those processes and the arising of a conscious being all depends on so many conditions, right? And this is, something maybe I don't need to say any more about. But don't we somehow believe that there's a self in there? But what is that? Why is there a need for a self? It's a coming together of these different conditions. In later Buddhism, it also looks at these individual aspects of the human being, the five aggregates, as each one themselves being empty of its own nature. The Chinese terminology is 缘起性空, meaning that each aggregate, the physical form of a human body, it's not just one thing, right? It's also a coming together of many elements. Feelings, feelings in their constant change, and the fact that feelings need certain objects or certain contacts to happen in order to have any feeling, and so on. Perception, consciousness, each one of these is also without self, so to speak. So Buddhism eventually looks at any kind of concept, any any way that we can analyze and look at something as an object in itself is actually, it's not accurate. Even the five aggregates is an abstraction. And we may have a tendency to look at each aggregate as some kind of object. So Buddhism eventually developed this concept of emptiness, that all phenomenon, not just the human being is empty of a self, but every aspect of human being, every phenomenon in the universe is empty of any self nature. And so the concept emptiness is represents that any concept itself is not truth. Any object that we see is a perception. And if we hold to it, we can get caught by it. We still can get caught in a belief of permanence. So Buddhism is gradually analyzing the human being and breaking it down to show that the self of the person doesn't exist, as well as the self of these individual aspects of human experience. Modern science breaks things down into what? Atoms, and even atoms are made up of smaller elements, what? Protons, neutrons, electrons. It's been a while since I learned physics. And even quarks. Everything can be divided, at least theoretically. But we can see that nothing can stand on its own. So what is birth? Is birth really the beginning of something? Is it the beginning of a self? Or is birth a self coming from somewhere and now being here? Buddhism says that question is actually, it doesn't apply. Before birth, there was no self to come from somewhere. Birth is just a coming together of conditions. Life itself, existence, there's no self there either. It's just a continuation of a change of conditions. So, what about death? The idea of non being, or the question of where will I go when I die? Buddhism's view is that that question is also, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't apply because there's no self to go somewhere. It's just the coming apart of conditions. Birth is a coming together of conditions. Death, what we call death, is a coming apart of conditions. This is where the idea of no birth and no death comes from. Buddhism is not trying to negate that there's actually, when a baby is born and comes out, we're not denying its existence, saying, oh, nothing happened. There's no baby. I don't see a baby. I don't have to take care of it, or it's not my baby. There's no birth. Or that when someone dies, it's like, oh, there's no such thing as death. Let's not worry about it. We don't need to go to any funerals. It's not denying the phenomenon. It's just pointing out that birth is not somehow a beginning, an ultimate beginning, and death is not an ultimate end. It's just a coming together or a coming apart of causes and conditions. And we can use different analogies or phenomenon to look at this. Just look at burning wood. I've been having some fires recently on in the backyard. We just get some logs, we make a fire. We burn the wood, and the wood's burning, and it's actually beautiful to just sit there and watch. Look at the fire. Watch it change. Watch the wood burn and the fire glow. When the wood is all burnt up, does it just disappear? If we completely burnt the wood, okay, in this example, there's probably some embers left and charcoal left. If we completely burnt it all up, the fire was so hot that everything burned. What's left? Is there nothing left after the wood is burned? Oh, it's not. There's ashes left at least. Even if it's so hot, there's no ashes. I don't know, is that possible to burn something that even the ashes are not left? Isn't heat left over? Isn't smoke left over? Moisture? Whatever was burned is now part of the atmosphere. So it's not nothing. Interesting again how modern science recognizes that nothing is actually created or destroyed. It's just a transformation of energy or of matter, right? Again, I'm such a like a baby when it comes to physics, but that's a basic principle of physics. Nothing is created or disappears. Buddhism agrees with this, not only on a level of material, but on a spiritual level. That a human being with death doesn't just disappear. That doesn't make sense. With death, there's a transformation and there's a continuation. Of course, we know that when we die, our body will decompose. Um, and I don't know if you've heard there are these new burials where you can have your body planted underneath a tree so that your body can be nourishment for a tree. That's actually what I hope to do. I like to have my body be part of a tree or of a forest. Um, so essentially, our physical body is nutrition for new life. It doesn't disappear, it transforms. It actually becomes new life. Without the nutrition of our body and all the other bodies that are dying, so to speak, it's all nutrition for new life. There's also another analogy, which will help us to understand the principle of human death and rebirth, which is such a huge and mystical topic in Buddhism, which I usually never talk about. I don't want to say never, but don't usually talk about. I'd like to address it tonight, where let's just first look at the death or the life and the death of a star. Have you ever wondered where the stars come from? You know, we see them when we look in the sky every day. We see these glowing stars, and maybe we know a little bit about them, how they're very similar to our sun and even thousands of times more enormous than our sun in our own solar system. How do stars come about? Again, this is my elementary physics knowledge, but stars are often formed from other stars or the leftovers of other stars and just other materials in space. Materials including gases and dust, small particles. And as those gases and dust actually mix, cross paths, and there's friction, it starts to create attraction and a buildup of gases to the point where this gas and dust is mixing and creating heat and pressure, and gravity is pulling it together as it gets bigger. And eventually, stars build into these giant balls of gas and dusts and heat and constant chemical change that creates what we see as light. If there are any physicists, please don't mind me. I like to maybe chat afterwards as well. But isn't that fascinating? From a mass of dust, it accumulates into a ball, a glowing ball, an enormous star, an enormous mass. And during the life of the star, it's giving off light, the creation of heat and all those chemical processes give off light. And maybe we don't think about it much, but when we see stars, how do we actually see stars? They're so incredibly far away. We can't touch them, but the light travels. And how does light travel? Light travels through light years, incredible distances, as tiny particles or waves. Again, this could be debatable. Particles, waves, particles, and waves traveling through space until it touches our eyes and the structures in our eyes. Isn't that amazing? And the stars giving off light, what we see is the light. Through the whole life of the star, it's giving and sending off light in all directions. But eventually, the star and its gases and all of that stuff starts to burn out or lose its energy to the point where the star could explode or the star could kind of fizzle out and turn into this just clump of more of a lifeless block of matter that doesn't give off light or nearly as much light as it used to. And it can also eventually break apart and again become a big cloud of gas and dust, which could be blown and moved around through space. And what's also interesting is that we may be seeing a star that doesn't even exist. The star has burnt out long ago, but we can still see it. The light is still coming at us and touching our eyes. So we look up and we see a star. But the actual body of the star may have burnt out ages ago. But the light of the star continues. The light continues to travel throughout space in countless directions. Do you think that's fascinating? I think that's fascinating. But how does that relate now to human life, death, and rebirth? The principle of causes and conditions of Buddhism is, in a way, very scientific in that it looks at our own life, our birth as a coming together of causes and conditions, and our actions, our behavior as also a result of different conditions, and that our behavior, in a way, in the same way that stars send out light, our behavior has effects. And even though we've finished doing something, the effect of that behavior may continue to resonate with the world, right? Like our behavior can really affect a lot of other people for years and years to come. Just like the Buddhist teachings that we're studying now, the Buddha passed away long ago, but his light, so to speak, or his teachings and the effects of his behavior and way of living continue to resonate within people all over the world. So if we look at the question of where do I go when I die, we can also see how it doesn't really make sense. If there's no permanent self while we're alive, how could there be a going to somewhere? Death is also just a separation of conditions. The physical body disintegrates, but our actions continue to resonate, just like the light of a star continues after the star has burnt out. The effects of our behavior continue to live on or continue to resonate within other people and affect the physical environment as well. Isn't there a saying that we're survived by our actions? Um, Even though our physical body dies, our mind continues. This is one way to look at rebirth from the principle of causes and conditions, the causes and effects of our life and our death. So for those of you who have can more easily align with reason and the logic of Buddhism, logic of Buddhism is conditioned arising and conditioned perishing. Nothing really begins or ends. Birth is not a beginning, death is not an end. Birth is just a new coming together, a new transformation. So isn't death in the same way? Death is also a transformation, a continuation of life in new forms. And our new life, so to speak, our rebirth, from this angle, we are reborn all over the world. The effects of our life and the way we live are bringing, could say, birthing or affecting the birth of many things in the world. The way we lived could affect the parents of a child, and the parents of that child then transmit the way we live to that new child. Or people that we never knew who hear about the way we live, how we treat other people, how we try to live with more wisdom, that can affect countless people um, and create conditions for more wisdom, create conditions for more people to live compassionately. So, from this angle, from a logical angle, we could say this is one view of rebirth. The conditions of our life transforming to affect new life. But you may be still wondering, well, what's all this stuff about rebirth and the Buddhist idea of reincarnation? This is something that we have to, if you want to believe, or if you find this helpful for you, this is based on faith. There is another view of Buddhism, of rebirth, which is in accord with the logic of conditioned arising. It's in accord with this logic of selfless transformation, but it requires some faith. The basic idea is that when a person dies and the body disintegrates, the consciousness of that living being continues on, um, as a as a collection, not as a soul, not as a self that's unchanging, but as a collection of tendencies and information. And that collection of information and tendency, or karma, when a new life is reborn, when we go back to the biology of birth, the consciousness comes together with the sperm and the egg, and together is a new being. This requires a certain degree of faith because it's nothing that could be observed or directly seen according to our experience at the moment. And this can be something which many people find challenging, and which they may say, well, I agree with most of Buddhism except this whole rebirth part. That's the thing I can't accept, can't digest. And that's okay. You don't have to. Even just being aligned with or understanding the logic of causes and conditions, and that with your death, the effects of your life will continue, that can still help a person live in a way which is um, more virtuous, and give a person motivation to live a life of wisdom and follow this practice of developing wisdom, developing insight. It's okay. But for some people, they believe. They believe in the continuation of this consciousness from being to being, life after life, this collection of consciousness and tendency. There's another analogy which could help some of us grasp this more faith-based understanding of rebirth, and see what you think. It's something I thought of. I don't know if somebody else thought of it before me. Probably they did somewhere. But just look at cell phones. What do we do when we get a new cell phone? What's the process of transferring our information from one cell phone to another? Back in the day, you used to have to connect a wire from one cell phone to the other, right? Now we don't have to do that. You just put them next to each other, or you just put them in the same field of a Wi-Fi signal so you can get information from one cell phone to the other. It just has to be somewhere within this reach of the Wi-Fi signal. Um, isn't that kind of amazing as well? I mean, the fact that there's this block of glass and parts and pieces, the hardware of the cell phone, in combination with electricity, as well as the what's Wi-Fi? Wi-Fi is actually what? Electromagnetic waves. It's radio waves, I think. Right? Wi-Fi is radio waves? I think so. With the field of radio waves with electricity, you can get information from one object invisibly to another object. I mean, this is something we do all the time. We don't think about it. We're using it right now, actually. I'm using it to connect to the internet. We can't see any of this, yet we know it exists. We believe it, and it's just part of everyday life. You know, Wi-Fi is not visible, at least with the human eye. There's many things that are not visible, but we can see the effects. In some way, could the rebirth of consciousness of a human being, this collection of tendencies and information of one human life, could it go through the field of space even without Wi-Fi, to another material being? I mean, if you think about it that way, it's not too far away from updating your cell phone or transferring information from your cell phone. This is, amazing technology that's human created. How much more so the amazing, wondrous um, world, all of its living beings. That's a creation of causes and conditions. Buddhism doesn't have the belief of a creator God. Buddhism sees life, birth, life, death as a coming together of causes, coming apart of causes and conditions, and this continuous transformation, cause and effect through time and space. So, where did I come from? Who am I? Where did I go? Is it clearer now how Buddhism looks at these questions? The idea of I coming and going just doesn't make sense in the light of causes and conditions. It's as bizarre as asking a question. It's like if you make a sandcastle, and probably all done this. You make a sandcastle. It was fun. You look at it, and then what do you do when you finish the sandcastle? You destroy it. That's the best part. Some kids love that, or some adults love destroying the sandcastle. That's the best part. When the sandcastle is destroyed, do you ask, where did the sandcastle go? Right? Before the sandcastle was made, do we ask, hey, where did the sandcastle come from? The sandcastle before it was made was just a bunch of sand elements, individual elements of sand. When the sandcastle is made, it's still a collection of sand. When the sandcastle is destroyed or when it dies, it's still just conditions that have come apart. In the light of emptiness, even the idea of a grain of sand, in the Buddhist scriptures, they often use grains of sand as very tiny things or motes of dust. Modern science would call those atoms. Even those don't have any self-nature. So even that concept we can go beyond. So this is where the idea of transcending birth and death comes from. The Buddhist view of transcending birth and death, there's actually two kinds of views. One view is more dualistic, actually. Even though we went to great lengths to look at the non-existence of the self and the problem with duality, there is a view within Buddhism that's more dualistic, which is some people think that to escape birth and death, we have to be outside of the cycle of birth and death, meaning to be free from any kind of being, human being, animal being, ghosts or gods or any kind of being. To be liberated is to eventually be free from any states of being. The phrase in Chinese which is used is 不受后有, to no more receive any state of existence. So a person, from this dualistic view, a person who is liberated, while they're alive, they're free from suffering, free from vexation. When they pass away, when their body disintegrates, what's left? Well, it's said that nirvana is left. It's not a state of being. There's no more returning to the next life. There's no more transformation to another life or another state of being. There's just nirvana. But what is that? Some people used to think that Buddhism taught about annihilation. They say, well, if the liberated person doesn't have any state of being after death. Well, isn't that just nothing? Is Buddhism teaching nothingness? And that's not it. Um, with that dualistic view, there's still the idea of nirvana, that it's somehow beyond existence, it's beyond annihilation. And the Buddha often didn't say much. What is that? But still, some people see this liberation of nirvana as opposite to birth and death. So to escape birth and death, we have to go to nirvana, and there's no more birth and death. That's still a kind of dualistic view, getting away from birth and death to go to some unconditional kind of state, which you can't even talk about. Another view of transcending birth and death is the view of Mahayana Buddhism, which describes transcending birth and death not as escaping states of being to go into some uh, nirvana, but it's actually in any state of being, in the midst of birth and death, free from birth and death. In the midst of birth and death, not seeing it really as birth, a beginning of self, or death as the end of self. Not seeing the separation of birth and death, or this life and that life, but just seeing everything as causes and conditions, seeing everything as empty, but still wondrously existing. Zhen, the term is Zhen Kong Miao You. Everything is wonderfully existing. It's just empty of any permanence, empty of any self. With that view, with that experience of life, there's no need to fear birth and death, or there's no need to fear transformation. There's no need to be overly happy or craving when conditions come together and there's birth or there's being, and there's no need to fear or be devastated when conditions come apart. And that state of being transforms, changes. That's the freedom or transcendence that Mahayana Buddhism talks about or advocates. Not escaping birth and death, but participating fully in it. This is the ideal of the bodhisattva, a being who is aspires to awaken and awaken all other living beings. That was a lot of theory, huh? I squeezed that into 120 minutes. I'm sorry, not 120, but an hour and 20 minutes. Briefly, even if we know this theory front and back, inside and out, it still can't save us from fearing death and craving birth. It's just a background to give us some direction on how Buddhist practice can take us from a dualistic view fixated on self to a view of life free of self, free of permanence, and at ease, at peace with the changing conditions. So what do we do if reason can't save us? This is where we need to practice. The practice of what I mentioned at the beginning, the Chan practice of Huatou, which Huatou, that word can be translated as the practice of a critical phrase. The question that's asked in this Huatou practice, one of them, is actually not where did I come from? The question is actually this: what was my original face before I was born? The Chinese is 未出娘胎前本来面目是谁? Before It could actually also be translated as before my parents were born, what was my original face? It doesn't mean who was I before I was born in this life. It actually means before birth and death, and before even the concept of birth and death comes to mind. What is that? It's actually asking, what is that before the concept of self arises? So there's another Huatou, which is possibly more accurate. 意念未生前，本来面目是谁？一念一个念头未生前，本来面目是谁？ So before any thought or any concept of birth and death, self comes to mind, who is that? The Chinese word 谁 means who. This may seem confusing because all of Buddhism talks about there being no permanent self at the center of our human experience. Yet this question is asking, who is it? Because despite there being no permanent self in the body and mental processes, there's still an ability to be aware of the body and mind. There's still the capacity to be aware of the change of feelings and thoughts and consciousness. So what is that? What is that capacity to be aware of all this? That capacity, which other teachings of Buddhism describe it as Buddha nature, or basically the nature to be awake and to be aware, the nature of being a fully conscious being before even a thought arises. What is that? What's that original or fundamental face, so to speak? What's that most fundamental capacity to be aware? Huatou is looking into that. It's looking inwards before any kind of concept of self or birth and death, nirvana, liberation, any of that. Before any of that arises, what is our human experience? So Huatou is actually the practice of, while you know the theory of Buddhist practice, you have to wipe it all away. All of the ideas of Buddhism, all of the ideas of impermanence, not self, emptiness, all need to be wiped away in order to truly investigate the nature of our experience. Any answer that comes through thinking or any conclusion that comes just intellectually, it's just a bunch of ideas. Huatou is looking what is before those ideas even arise. Huatou literally means before words. Tou could mean before. Huatou, before words or thoughts have even arisen. What is that? What is that experience? According to Chan Buddhism, it's said that when a person can investigate their mind in this way and break through the cloud of thinking, the cloud of attachments, cloud of scattered thinking, even the cloud of concentrated states of mind and concentrated states of being, if we can see into that or experience that, we will know the nature of human existence or the nature of everything beyond concept, beyond ideas, beyond birth and death, and beyond the three questions we started with. Where did I come from? Who am I? Where will I go? When we realize the nature of the mind, this capacity to be awake and aware, those questions won't be a problem. We'll be very confident and clear in where we stand at this moment. When we're confident and clear in where we stand in this moment, we won't worry about the future, whatever the causes and conditions bring. So I'd like to finish here in introducing the view of Buddhism and the practice of Chan Buddhism, of investigating these existential questions. I hope it was useful for you. And, now our time is officially up. But for those of you who wanted to spend some time to discuss, even ask some questions, I can be here. I can hang around for another half an hour if you like.